Piaget's second stage of cognitive development, called the pre-operational stage, occurs between the ages of approximately 2 and 7. According to Piaget, children in this stage are just beginning to develop their thinking skills. The evidence of this can be seen in their use of symbolic thought, such as using words, images, and symbols to represent the world.
Symbolic thought is the ability to make one thing represent something else. So language is the prime example. Language is a system where you take arbitrary sounds and they represent things. Another example of symbolic thought would be make-believe play. You watch a child having an object like a broom and straddling it and pretending like it's a horse. So the broom is a symbol for the horse. That's symbolic reasoning.
By the time babies got to be able to talk, Piaget thought they did start having a real representation of the world separately from their own actions on the world, what he called a symbolic representation. But he still thought those representations were very different from adult representations, adult ways of viewing the world.
Come on. Follow Connor.
In particular, he thought that preschoolers and toddlers couldn't think logically. So they couldn't put together things in a logical way. He thought that they couldn't think causally. They didn't understand that one thing made another thing happen. He thought that they were egocentric. They couldn't take the perspective of another person. They couldn't see that the world might look one way to them and look another way to another person.
Starting at around 6, 7 years of age, you have the concrete operational stage, and here the child becomes logical. And concrete operations, that means that their logic is tied to concrete activities and tasks. They can now deduce relationships. They can think in a sequence.
Connor, can you tell Mommy which of these has more liquid, or are they the same?
One way of testing whether or not a child has reached the concrete operational stage is to perform a simple test called the conservation task. The principle of conservation tells us that two equal physical quantities remain equal even if the appearance of one is changed.
No, I think they're the same size.
Okay.
That's how much red there was.
Okay. Now, Connor, which container has more liquid, or are they the same?
For this one, let's see. I think the red one does.
As you can see, a child in the pre-operational stage is not able to grasp this concept.
If you presented the same conservation of liquid task to a concrete operational child, you would have a totally different response than a pre-operational child.
Now, which container has more liquid, or are they the same?
The same.
The same. Why?
The concrete operational child would look at beakers A and C, and he would say, they have the same amount. And then you'd ask, well, how do you know that? And he would use one of 3 reasons to tell you that they're the same.
Because it doesn't really matter if you put it in a bigger container than this, so it doesn't actually change the measurement.
Very good. You're absolutely right.
And these reasons depend upon a new ability that concrete operational children have, which is called reversibility. And one type of reversibility, the child would be able to mentally pour the liquid from beaker C back into beaker B. And he would say to you, beaker A and beaker C have the same amount, because if you poured the liquid from beaker C back into beaker B, it would still be the same. Another type of reversibility that the concrete operational child might use would be to say that, well, the liquid level in beaker C is higher, but it's also skinnier. And so this child is able to see a reciprocity or compensation between height and width. And then finally, the concrete operational child might say to you, well, beaker A and beaker C have the same amount because nothing was added or taken away, so you have to have the same amount of liquid.
In spite of this newfound ability, the logical thought processes of children in the concrete operational stage still tend to be limited to concrete reality. For example, if you ask a child what it means when we say, people who live in glass houses should not throw stones, you might get this response.
Because the house might fall down and it might break.
However, in Piaget's last stage of child development, at the beginning of adolescence, we see the limitations on abstract logical thought fall away.
The formal operational stage involves a real shift in the child's thinking. For one thing, the child is able to think abstractly. So, for example, they're better able to understand algebra, which deals with things like X's and Y's and dots and lines and planes in space. Those are real abstractions. That's a lot different from adding apples, for example, which is very concrete. And if you asked a formal operational child to define the sentence, "People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones," a formal operational child who's more comfortable dealing with the abstract would see that there's an alternate meaning to that phrase.
Jean Piaget's groundbreaking theory on cognitive development has provided the foundation for thousands of subsequent research studies. And while psychologists have been able to replicate many of Piaget's results, they have also found that his theory is, by no means, perfect.
One of the criticisms is that Piaget underestimated children's ability. So the ages at which Piaget thought children would master certain milestones, actually they occur much earlier than Piaget envisioned.
Piaget thought that babies and children couldn't take the perspective of another person until well into the school age period. Well, it turns out now that that's not true, that in fact children are learning about how other people think and feel and understand and what they believe about the world, especially in the period between about 18 months and 5, in that preschool period.
I'm going to eat that one, and Daddy's going to eat the burnt one, because that's the way he likes it.
Why? It's
don't-
bit. I think it's bit.
He thinks it tastes good.
Another criticism is the fact that it's a stage theory. We find that development is sometimes more smooth or gradual. The transition isn't as abrupt as a stage theory might suggest it should be.
In addition, researchers have found that very young children, those that Piaget would classify as pre-operational, do have the capacity for logical thought, if you ask them the right questions.
So if you ask the children about things that they don't understand very well, then they'll give you these kind of illogical responses. If you ask the children about other kinds of things that they do understand, they seem to be much better at making predictions. So a nice example of this is if you look at children's explanations, for example. It turns out that 3- and 4-year-olds can give you very good logical explanations for things like why it is that I can't walk through a wall. Or why it is that I'll go to the fridge if I'm hungry. Although if you ask them about other things like why we have night and day, the kinds of things that Piaget asked about, you might get very illogical answers.
Finally, there's some suggestion that Piaget's stages are not always universal. In other words, culture or experience can play a role in the development of some of Piaget's concepts.
Now we're in this situation where Piaget's theory, which once was such a sustaining force for us in cognitive development, has crumbled, and we don't quite know what's going to come and take its place. And there are a lot of different alternatives.
There's a new theory that has received a lot of attention. It's called the ecological systems theory. And all that means is, what are the contextual influences in the child's life? His immediate family, his school, his society, the world, etc. How do those impact the child's development?
Say bye-bye.
And so instead of looking at a child in the laboratory, we're going out and looking at how the context in which the child develops affects his development. And of course, culture then is going to have an influence on the child's development because each child grows up in a unique culture.
Yeah, I always thought I was happy, you know, just Kim and I, and that was great. But now having children and knowing that you created that human being it's amazing to me, and that just gives me a lot of joy in everything that they do and the things that we can do as a family.
When couples are feeling pretty good about the way they manage the things in their life as a couple, the problems that confront them, the struggles that they have, they tend to be more responsive to their children. They're warmer and they're helpful to their kids when their kids are stuck on issues in ways that parents who are more tense with each other aren't as able to do. And when that happens, when the couple's more effective and the parenting is more effective, not too surprisingly, we see that the kids are actually doing better in their lives.
Psychologists will undoubtedly continue to study the fascinating process of human development, because it is through this research that we may gain a better understanding of how our life stories are written as we live the human experience.